We have another tragic event, this time in Nashville, where someone who identified as trans came into a school and just started open firing on anyone in sight. Now, the police have said that there is a manifesto. They're not releasing the manifesto, but they have released already some details like this person was trans, he or she was 28 years old, and they came in, and this may have been potentially caused by some strife, internal strife, where they were going after let's say a pastor that was from that school trying to help this person, and they had resentment towards that person. So there's a lot of issues here. Obviously, the first thing I want to mention is mental health, right? I don't really want to get too much into the incident because it's all over the news, but in regards to mental health, this is something that not many people are talking about. Mental health is encouraged now by our society. So, of course, there's gender dysphoria, and you have the right to identify yourself as whoever you want to be. You can be an attack helicopter, you can be a man, you can be a woman, you can be a ferret. It really doesn't matter. In this country, you have liberty, you have freedom. That means you can express yourself however you want. Here's the problem. Culturally, when we encourage individuals with bad mental health, instead of helping these individuals solve what's going on internally, we're promoting an ideology that stimulates a type of degradation in our society. And let's also tie in tandem with this whole gender ideology, we have Big Pharma who is supplying certain medications, and over 90% of the people who commit these kind of tragedies in schools, they're on some type of antidepressant, which has different symptoms like the loss of empathy. So now you no longer care about other individuals or being in their position. You have suicidal and depressive thoughts. So you put all these things together. Like, empathy is why we have rights in the first place. When you have empathy, you are putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You are saying, what is it like to be Timmy, who's 10 years old? I'm a little kid, I'm roaming around, I'm curious, whatever. You're able to, it's not sympathy, that's something else, but you're able to be in that person's shoes and understand what it would be like to be that person. So you wouldn't want to infringe on his or her rights, therefore you don't want someone to infringe on your rights. When you lose empathy, and you're suicidal, and you have depressive thoughts, you're very nihilistic about the world, you're very, another way of looking at it, another way of perceiving this type of situation, this feeling that some of these individuals have with internal strife in tandem with Big Pharma medication. And again, you have a right to take the Big Pharma substance, but we need to culturally acknowledge that there are symptoms that come about taking these medications. You almost feel numb to everything around you. You feel very apathetic to the world. You'll go outside, walk around, drive in your car. You don't really feel anything. You don't have a positive emotion, but you don't have a negative emotion. It's also the same type of medication that people are given for anxiety. Anxiety is when you have nervosa, right? You're anxious, which is also very akin to excitement. It's just perceiving in a different way, right? So if you're excited, that's really nervousness, but with a more positive emotion. Nervousness is more of a negative emotion. So when you take the anti-anxiety medication or antidepressant medication, you're actually, first off, we have those emotions for a reason. Those emotions are our body's way of telling us, hey, we need, let's say we're depressed, right? There might be a chemical imbalance, but a lot of times, most of the time, it's not a genetic chemical imbalance, and there are other variables that can attribute to depression. But generally speaking, when someone is in a depressive mood, it's temporary, and it's telling that person, you don't like the situation that you're in. You don't like your status in the hierarchy, which could also mean that your serotonin levels are going to be very low because you feel like you're at the bottom of the barrel. You can't really climb out of the barrel. And that is really your body saying you need to move out of this situation and you need to take some action to get from this emotion to the next emotion. Emotions are temporary. They're there to move us from state to state. When you're hungry, that's a type of an emotion. I need to fuel myself with some nutrition so I can sustain my survival. When you're thirsty, it's the same thing. We have all these different emotions. We have all these different feelings so that we can take action to move from one state to the next state. When we take these moods, these emotions, these feelings, and we medicate ourselves because we don't want to feel like whatever this existence is offering us in that period of time, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice because we're numbing how we're supposed to interact with the world. And when we lose that empathy, when we have depressive thoughts, that's when you really start you start to lose care for people and things. You don't really care what happens. And that's not a good place to be because there are actions that you may take that will have could have positive consequences, but most of the time there are negative consequences that arise out of that. I will also throw in that this is another in for the establishment and the centralized power to introduce gun control, they will say, well, this was caused by guns. No, it was a person. Time and time again, it's a person. When you have a bad guy with a gun, who comes in to stop that person? You have a good guy with a gun. So when we let's look at military bases and police departments. Do we ever see any tragedies like this in those specific places? No, because everyone is armed. It only happens in the places where people are not armed, or there's not many armed people. And so we've taken these publicly funded areas, okay, schools, institutions. If they're a public school, they're publicly funded, which means you do have a right to your Second Amendment. You have a right to every amendment. You have everything accessible to you with the Bill of Rights. But we have laws and ordinances passed, depending on the city, that bar your Bill of Rights. And you have local police departments that will enforce unconstitutional laws. So technically speaking, you could be armed in a school. I know many people don't agree with that. They don't like that, but that's in our Constitution. I'm just stating what is, okay? I'm not endorsing anything. I'm stating what is. But when you have now actively, you put gun-free zones on publicly funded areas, which again, that's unconstitutional, people are going to look at, deranged people are going to look at these areas as, this is a really good target. I can actually do some damage here, and we don't want that person to do damage. We want to fortify every area that we can, not necessarily to have a bunch of cops everywhere, although yes, beef up security, beef up cops. We have to make sure not to infringe on people's rights. So some schools have metal detectors. We cannot have metal detectors. That's unlawful search and seizure. That's against the Fourth Amendment. But what we can have is armed policemen who are patrolling the area. What we can also have is encourage teachers to be armed. You can have some training that is part of you being a teacher in that school. But in all honesty, that's still part of the Second Amendment. They have a right to keep and bear arms. And so you have to have good guys with arms to protect everyone else from bad guys with arms. You'll have crazy people all the time, even if we solve the problem. Well, we're not going to entirely solve the problem of mental illness, but even if we crack down as tight as we can, there are still going to be bad guys. There are still going to be people who are mentally ill, mentally deranged, and they don't really care about the consequences. They don't care about whatever repercussions are going to come about them. I'll also throw in that a lot of people will say, well, this is why we need to do background checks. This person may have gotten their guns legally, but they were at the same time getting prescriptions for medication, and that medication influenced their mood, their feelings, their way of thinking. This is now, and I'm trying to refrain from using this word, but a slippery slope. When you have a background check that's already against the Second Amendment, I'll explain that. The Second Amendment says Congress shall pass no law, or this shall not be infringed, okay? That means no law that Congress passes, because Congress creates the law, can go against the Second Amendment. Right now we have over 20,000 laws on the books against guns. And so while I would agree that having a background check is reasonable, and I would endorse that, it is not constitutional, okay? So again, I am able to put my personal opinion separate from what the Constitution says, and that is because that can be exploited. A background check can be exploited by a centralized state. You have the FBI, that's where the background check is coming from. You can have the government come in and say, oh, well, you're taking, let's say, acne medication, and we're considering that a prescription, and you can't have any kind of prescriptions in this schedule, and therefore you can't get a firearm. There are ways to exploit it, right? That's why we have absolute rights versus reasonable rights. Reasonable rights, all laws and rights are going to be exploited by a centralized power who wants more and more power. But when you have reasonable rights, reasonable laws, there's some give and take there, okay? That's what the court system is for. When you have absolute rights, there's no give and take. You have those rights whether a centralized power wants to take those rights away or not, or water them down or degrade them in any way. And that is because it's to prevent tyrannical control. Yes, we have certain tragedies like this, not just these kind of tragedies, but overall tragedies in general. But what does the most damage is the current regime, the current ruling government, always does more damage to its own people than the people within the nation do to each other. That's just the way it's always been. We can look at mass famines, mass genocides. There's a lot of tragedy that has happened specifically in the 20th century, so during the 1900s, but obviously way before then, and it'll continue way after. And so having these absolute rights protects us. It's really a distribution of power. When you have a centralized figure, centralized authority, you first in the government need to redistribute all the power. You can't have one centralized figure like Kim Jong-un who has all the power, because you'll have coups that form all the time. And there's a lot of anxiety and risk, a lot of liability that comes with having all that power. So you redistribute it. So even the people at the top, there's a distribution of power. And then to prevent this government entity, which may have a few hundred to a few thousand people, maybe thousands of people who are connected or entangled within the government entities to prevent the centralized authority from having too much power over the people. Goes back to federalists and anti-federalists. You have the people who have a certain amount of rights, and those rights are essentially giving power to the people to combat an authoritarian regime. So having guns, for example, having arms, is a deterrent to promote due process by government if they're going to exploit someone's individual rights or someone's situation. Let's say the district attorney files a false criminal charge on someone. There has to be a due process to go through the judicial system to fight that charge. Otherwise, it could be like other Western, it could be like the East, but I'm specifically mentioning Australia, Britain, so more Western powers. Because their population is not armed, we saw in the past few years, they broke into people's homes, they dragged people out without due process, and they detained them indefinitely for a charge that by our American standard, they should not have been charged by or charged for. So we have to be very careful. There's two things here. Mental illness, which should not be encouraged, it should be helped, and we should promote the due diligence of big pharma and certain substances that people are taking in tandem with gun control is not the answer. Gun control is what gets us into problems like this. We have to be able to understand that from a critical point of view. But when people are manipulated during times of crisis, they're fear-mongered and they're told, hey, look at all these people who are, they no longer exist. They perished because of this crazed individual. But really, it wasn't the individual, because this happens all the time. It's the inanimate object. And people are so easily fooled, psychologically speaking. There's a strategy to this. People are so easily manipulated that they fall for this emotional reaction that they give out, and they pass sentiment to lawmakers to pass unconstitutional bills. And because there's enough power base in law enforcement to uphold the elite's ruling, that now actually antagonizes the people, because now the people don't have a way to defend themselves. See, the people at the top, they all have armed security. They have Capitol Police, they have Secret Service, they have all these federal agencies, they're all armed. But you, as we the people, if you're ever in a situation where you need to defend yourself, when seconds matter, the cops are minutes away. And oftentimes in a lot of these liberal areas they don't really care about the Constitution, they don't care about your individual rights, the cops may not even come to help, like we saw in 2020 when there were certain riots going on and the cops were called. The cops did not even go to those areas to help those individuals, and those individuals and their businesses, they all perished. And so we need to understand that dichotomy. Yes, tragedies like this are bad, but we have to actually find practical solutions instead of having the same old rhetoric that relinquishes our power from us as individuals back to the state. We know that the state doesn't care about us. They have unchecked power. They're not held accountable. And so they don't really care if there's collateral or not. They will use tragedy and crisis. They will leverage it for their interests, for their way of staying in office, for their way of gaining more power while they secure themselves in the hierarchy. It's not that intricate, but it can be intricate. And once we understand what they're doing, once we understand the psychological manipulation, it becomes that much easier for us to hold them accountable.